The whole wide world of string libraries. Honestly, in preparation for this, I could not remember all of the string libraries I've ever touched. This is insane. The amount of string libraries out there, the amount of bad string libraries out there, it's baffling. I can't even remember all of the ones that I've touched in my life. So I'll do my best to remember, but some of them are not even sold anymore. So, you know, I'm dating myself a little bit now. So there are two string libraries that are my absolute go-to, which is Cinematic Strings 2 and Cinematic Studio Strings, made by the same people. One is older, one is newer. The reason I got into Cinematic Strings 2 is because at the beginning when I was working at Cinesamples, I was helping out with customer support. And that was before CineStrings existed. So we would get a lot of support tickets for Cinematic Strings because people wrongfully assumed that that was a Cinesamples product. It's an honest mistake. But so at first I would send out replies going, oh, we don't have a string library. I don't know what you're talking about. But so we got so many support tickets that at some point I was like, what is this library that I've never heard of? And it turns out that it was actually a really, really good library and I loved it and I bought it. And so at that point, I could actually answer the support tickets. So whenever we would get a support ticket for Cinematic Strings, and I would know the answer because now I was using the product, I would actually just give them an answer. You're welcome, Cinematic Strings. I answered your support tickets, and Cinesamples paid for it. But it's fine. I always kind of put in the disclaimer that this is not our product, but I'm still gonna help you out. So it made everybody look good. It's fine. But so that very quickly became my favorite library to use because it sounds good out of the box. The interface is whatever. I don't look at it much. Different mic positions, the spiel that we had with the other libraries as well. But just the ease of playing. It just sounds good. And it plays very, very nicely. It's well timed and the velocities blend well. There are no bad loops, no bad samples, no bad editing. The programming is great. The scripting is great. And it has all the basics that you need 99% of the time. So I was just like, the ease of use of this library is just astounding. It's what I was missing in all the other libraries. So then naturally, when Cinematic Studio Strings came out, the newer library by the same people, I totally went for it. And it's an equally great library. It looks a bit better and it's a bit newer. Funny enough, I don't use it by itself. I layer it together with Cinematic Strings 2 because Cinematic Strings 2 is a very bright sounding library with a lot of air on top. And then Cinematic Studio Strings is a very mellow, warm sounding library that is very expressive, but is kind of lacking the air on top and the brightness to cut through specifically in a full orchestral piece. But together, they fill in each other's gaps, and it just makes for the almost perfect string sound. I use the legato slightly differently because they have this system where the velocity determines the legato speed. And I find that in Cinematic Strings, the slow legato actually sounds better. And in Cinematic Studio Strings, the long legato sounds better. I mean, that's a question of taste. I generally tend to use faster legatos because it's more realistic. I remember when, before we were making CineStrings, people kept requesting portamentos and just all these different legato styles. First of all, that's impossible to accommodate. It's never going to sound good. But also, that's just not how modern film scores sound. If you want portamento at a session, you have to tell the player specifically that you want that because they will not naturally do that. So it doesn't really make sense to request all these specific things. If you have two different legato speeds, you're fine. Also, I don't know any professional that, is going into their legatos and just kind of, massages that for hours and hours on end. Because we don't have time for that. We need like one or two good sounding legato transitions and that's it. But the more playable it is, the better. We don't even care. And so these libraries are just so easy to program. The transitions between the velocities are very seamless. There's no phasing that you have in other libraries. I don't really have any complaints. Like all of their products, Cinematic Studio Strings are locked in contact in the backend. You can't get in. Again, I haven't felt the need to go in, so you make a perfect library, you can lock it, and I'm not going to complain. Sometimes I will get standing notes. I get that with all libraries, but a little bit more, I think, with Cinematic Strings. But you just hit the exclamation mark. I had that in my Q&A video, and it's fixed. I mean, there's probably a ton more to say about these libraries, but just know that I think currently on the market, those two combined make for the best string sound. It's amazing what they're doing. They're also not particularly resource heavy, so you can run a lot of it, and they're just great. They're all around great. That's my glowing endorsement of these two libraries. Just get them and dump whatever else you've been using. then, in order to give the strings a little bit of crispiness, since these are ensemble patches and they, you know, have this sweeping sound, kind of similar to Cinebrass, that has a nice ensemble sound but needed a bit more refined detail to it, I layer CineStrings Solo into it. Arguably, I think the best solo string library out there currently. Not a big fan of the bow changes, but I know why they did that, because they had to edit it in a specific way and it prevents other issues, so fine, I'll deal with it. It just sounds good. It's a very expressive library. It sounds great out of the box. It needs a little bit of tweaking with the legatos, but once you have that down, it's all good. I have actually programmed solo passages and then put on a bit of reverb, and people actually thought it was like a live violin, which it wasn't. So, but layering in that library, that also, by the way, looks exactly like the other Cine series libraries, comes with the same mic positions, yada yada. I'm not going to repeat all of that every single time. Layering that into cinematic strings and cinematic studio strings. Did I say that right? Yeah. Gives it that slight crunch and definition that they need. And then also something, again, I just bought that because I got a discount from buying Cinematic Studio Strings. I also bought Cinematic Studio Strings Solo, which is kind of just as good as CineStrings Solo, but warmer. So if I need solo strings that blend a bit better and don't stand out as much, I use that one. But I also just layer that in, because all of these libraries are pretty much programmed the same way, which is also really nice. So I just end up programming lines in Cinematic Strings too, and then I can just copy paste that into the other libraries and not even touch it. So, you know, saves time and makes for a very pristine string sound. Then something else I use is Symphobia. I do use the ensemble patches sometimes just to compose. If it's a slow piece and I just want, you know, some string sustain patches and I don't want to compose in the piano track. But you know what? Layering their libraries into stuff, especially slow stuff, can actually really open up the sound. But also layering in some of their shorts. They have some really aggressive shorts. layering those in for action sequences, you know, it doesn't hurt. It beefs it up a little bit. So I'm liking their strings very much. They're very simple. I wouldn't use them exposed by themselves, but to layer in, wonderful. I also use the CineStrings Runs, which incidentally also go with the Hollywood Winds runs. Sometimes, if I need it for a composition, I think it's very useful to have pre-recorded runs. They really only work in one way, though. So if you want this kind of Harry Potter-ish stuff, those runs that just kind of go around scales and stuff, they don't have that. And so I don't do that. That doesn't work. But if it's just like a simple run up or run down or something into a crescendo, it works. Now from Spitfire, I'm using, as mentioned before, I'm using Tundra. I think it has absolutely stunning special articulations in it. My favorite is probably the no rosin patch. It's basically strings played without putting rosin on their bows, and it just makes for this soft whispering sound. It's beautiful. But all of the textures in that library are very, very gorgeous. Really, really like it. And another thing I use is also the Olafur Arnalds. I hope I'm saying his name right. The chamber ensemble and the full ensemble and the composer toolkit as well. Just very creative. And I think that is where Spitfire beats out the entire competition. Their stuff is very creative. When they get away from we made a, regular sample library, and get into we made something really, really special, I think that's where they shine. I think that's where they make their best stuff, and I would buy anything from that. Regular libraries, the regular string libraries, again, not a fan. I used to use Mural at some studios. It was fine. It worked. But definitely inferior to the other libraries I just mentioned. I also used Sable at some studios to get in that crunch. It worked fine. Not by itself, but it worked fine for layering. It has the same issues that I've mentioned in the brass video. I'm not going to repeat myself. Same with the Albion stuff. It's fine, but not quite as good as the other stuff I mentioned. I don't really know what else they have. I haven't tried all of their stuff. Funny enough, whatever has the Zimmer brand on it doesn't seem to have the issues that I normally dislike about their stuff. Because I think those are also just very creative libraries. And again, that's where they shine. So, make of that what you will. It's also a question of taste, so don't hate me. Then Orchestral Tools obviously has a string library. Not a big fan. It's not a bad library. I mean, you can make it sound great, but it has this kind of thin sound to it. It's kind of lacking warmth and expressiveness, I think. It's very hard to describe. It's just in a one-on-one comparison, it doesn't quite hold up to Cinematic Strings and Cinematic Studio Strings, I think, sound-wise. I'm sure it's programmed nicely, but yeah, I don't know. It didn't work for me when I tried it. Then I do remember a long time ago, I did use the Adagio strings from, I think it was from ADO. I know it was all the rage at the time because it had all these different legato patches of different legatos. Again, nobody has time for that on a professional production. I don't have time to load 20 different legato patches and then play around with them and see which one works best. I mean, no. I have several minutes of music to write in a day. And also, it sounded fine, but it wasn't, I didn't find it super usable in a practical sense. Then, what else did we work with? LA scoring strings. LA scoring strings. Very outdated now. I don't think it ever sounded particularly good. I think one of the very few libraries that ever did DVC, because guess what? It doesn't work. Also one of the main requests we got for CineStrings. Do DVC, and we're like, it doesn't work. It doesn't sound good. And also it will make the library incredibly expensive because we need like double or triple the session time. But yeah, it was kind of out of tune and thin sounding. I used it for some layering, but not by itself. I never thought it worked particularly well. It was good for when it was made, but now it's just so outdated. I also owned Hollywood Strings. I mean, I still own it, but I don't use it anymore. I thought it was great at the time when it came out. I thought it was top-notch. But again, outdated now, badly timed. The sound doesn't hold up anymore. It's not particularly great anymore. And then, to my shame, I was one of the 5 people that made CineStrings. And yet, to my shame, I have to say, I have just very little of it in my template. I think it's a good sounding library. I think it could have been better. We just didn't have enough time. I think we made the whole thing in 3 months. It just wasn't a good idea to push for that. It had stages, I think, before we released it where it sounded better, and then we had to change stuff, and that made it worse. And, it just didn't turn out the library that we hoped it would be. We hoped it would be a slightly better version of cinematic strings, pretty much. With all the bread and butter articulation, something that's easy to play and that sounds gorgeous because it was recorded at Sony and it has that nice sizzle on top. And the overall sound of it is great. The playability is where I think most people have the issue. And it's also just a really far too heavy library. I remember we really pushed the boundaries so much that we had to dumb down our patches because Contact could not have this many groups in it anymore. So it is what it is. I'm not sure it will ever get a proper update. It's kind of a bit sad because I think it had the potential to be really great. And it's just good. It's not a terrible library, don't get me wrong. You can use it, you can make it sound good. It's just a little bit too much work for me when there are better options out there. But, I still use some of the patches. I do like the tremolo to Sulpon trem patches, and I like the harmonics that we recorded. I like the consistency between the articulations. It has some weaknesses that other libraries don't have, and so I gravitate more towards other libraries. But that's really the only issue. If you like it and you can use it and, you have it available to you, it's a very good library. So don't get me wrong here. This is just coming from someone who was very disappointed that it didn't turn out exactly the way that I wanted it to turn out, because I wanted it to be the string library to end all string libraries, and it just wasn't quite that. Now, I'm pretty sure there's a ton of other string libraries that I've used. Again, I'm having trouble remembering all of them because I've worked at such a variety of studios that honestly, I don't remember what all of these people had. I'm sure there was some Native Instruments stuff in there and some Sonokinetic stuff or whatever. I don't remember. Whatever it was, it has not left a lasting impression on me, so make of that what you will. I hope this was helpful to you guys. If you want me to do a review of any of these libraries in more detail, I can of course do that. But this is just kind of an overview of what you're going to find in my template.